Good morning, and I'd like to welcome those of you that are here on campus at George Washington University, as well as those of you who are joining us by webinar. And the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration of the George Washington University is delighted to partner with REI in sponsoring these monthly sessions dealing with various aspects of grants management. Just for your information, the Trachtenberg School offers 4 graduate degrees: the Master's of Public Administration, the Master of Public Policy, a Master in Environment and Resource Policy, and a PhD in Public Policy and Public Administration. And without further ado, I'd like to invite Jeff Meyer to come up to the podium and get the session started.
Thank you very much, Professor Cordes. REI Systems is pleased to sponsor these forums together with George Washington because we think it's really important that there be a sense of community of people who will have a chance to kind of talk with each other about problems they might be facing, about successes they've had, and to kind of provide not only just a kind of an informal network, but also the opportunity occasionally for things like career path, exchange of training and experiences working with various different types of grantees. As we made a presentation yesterday to some folks from the National Grants Management Association, what I found very interesting was there really is not a good way for a lot of federal government agencies to find out which grantees that may be receiving grants from multiple agencies. Are the experiences of one federal agency working with that grantee much better or much different than another? If one of them makes a 5 or a 10-year grant and another one just issues a new grant kind of 3 years into that cycle, and that grantee's having problems, the one that made the 5 or the 10-year grant may not know that. So we're interested in trying to think about innovative ways to help the federal government do a better job managing grants and achieving mission through grant programs. Just as a brief background, REI Systems provides custom grant making software and services related to it to about 8 or 10 different federal agencies, and as well to actually more than 100 different state and local agencies. So we're happy if any of you have questions or concerns or need assistance in grant management, REI Systems is happy to help with that. These forums, if you aren't aware, essentially kind of take a perspective from a variety of different agencies on topics that we think would be of interest to the entire community. And so this morning I've asked, and Sam Ashe from the National Institutes of Health, he's the director of the Office of Grants Policy, has agreed to come and talk a little bit about what NIH's experiences have been and what successes they've found in making competitive grants. And for those of you who perhaps are here for the first time, we've had previous speakers addressing, instead of competitive grants, addressing block grants from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. We had, I believe, 2 months ago, folks from Capitol Hill coming to talk about the GREAT Act and grant data standards. We'll be taking a hiatus in July and August, but in September, we will have an event where the Director of Grants for the state of Illinois will come and share a perspective of what it's like to be a major grant recipient for federal agencies and what sorts of innovations at the state level as a grant maker, because Illinois both receives federal grants and makes grants to cities and counties and special districts, what perspectives and innovations states are finding. So I think that will be interesting. I hope you'll look forward to that as well. But with all of that aside, let me first thank very much Sam Ashe for making it through what sounds like a horrendous commute and some not infrequent metro problems with the Red Line. And thank you for also stepping in at a very late date for a colleague who was unable to join us this morning. But we really appreciate it and look forward to hearing your thoughts. Sam has a background, interestingly, both at the department level at Health and Human Services and now at the Bureau or the Operating Division level within NIH. And as you all are aware, NIH is clearly one of the foremost competitive grant makers, I believe, helping kind of create and establish the U.S. competitive advantage in scientific research, particularly, of course, in the health arena. So thank you for your contributions and service to our country and our health. And let me ask Sam if you'll come up and share your thoughts and experiences with us.
Okay. So thank you for the great introduction, Jeff. How do I navigate through the slides here?
Arrow should push each.
Oh, okay.
There we go.
Perfect. So once again, thank you for inviting me out this morning. I'm filling in for Michelle Bowles, who is actually the director for the Office of Policy for Extramural Research at NIH. And I'm the director of the Division of Grants Policy, which is an office within OPERA. And both Michelle and I are within the Office of Extramural Research at NIH, and the Deputy Director, who Michelle's direct report is Dr. Mike Lauer. This morning, what we actually wanted to do is take a somewhat of a different spin on it. We wanted to just give you an update on some of the current issues that we're working through at the NIH as it comes to our competitive grant making process, and some of the policies that you will see within our Notice of Grant Awards that have been coming out over the past year. So the first, I think as you all know, on an annual basis, NIH receives annual appropriation. And with the receipt of our annual appropriation, there are certain administrative or legislative mandates that we have to follow. And one of those is the salary cap. For NIH, the salary cap in all HHS optives is capped at executive level 2. However, back in January, OPM actually raised that level for executive level 2 to $189,600. So that represented an increase. So what we actually did at NIH, anytime there's a policy change that's going to affect any of our terms and conditions of awards, we issue a guide notice. And so what you'll see here at the bottom of a lot of my slides, you'll see a link to the guide notice at the bottom, and that will provide you additional details regarding some of the policies that I'm going to touch on at a very high detail during the presentation.
Sam?
Yes.
Is there any reason we can't share these slides electronically with the audience at the end of the meeting?
No, sure.
Great.
Yes, so as I said, Jeff, you can feel free to share the slides. And then if you have any questions about a particular slide, feel free to reach out to me. You will have my contact information, and we can answer any questions that you have regarding the information shared. Similar to our legislative mandates guide notice, on an annual basis, NIH issues what we call the NIH Grants Policy Statement. The policy statement serves as a one-stop shop and serves as a term and condition for all of NIH grant awards. Within the GPS, what we actually do is all the guide notices that are issued throughout the year, we consolidate those and roll them into the next update of the annual GPS, which serves as a term and condition. When our recipients review the GPS, all the significant changes that are identified within that version, we actually issue an accompanying document called the Significant Changes Document to the NIH Grants Policy Statement. And as previously mentioned, all the changes that you will see, they will have resulted from a guide notice that we issued throughout the past fiscal year.
I'm not clear. May we ask questions during the presentation or after?
Yes, you can ask questions.
So I know there are a number of folks in the room who are similarly kind of at a parent organization level, and they have multiple components that are issuing grants. I also know that NIH has, I think it's 27 different institutes.
Yes.
So you're dealing with kind of 27 different children. Presumably you want them to know something about the changes in grants policy. How do you just send out the notice and say, here's the new policy, read it and do it, darn it? Or how do you get them to actually do something that kind of might be a change from what they've done in the past?
Is it in relation to the ICs or in relation to our recipients?
I'm thinking actually your institutes, the grantors,
okay.
the National Cancer Institute, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, etc. Because I'm thinking, again, for example, with HUD, we have a representative from the HUD department level, and she's dealing with public and Indian housing, and dealing with family housing, and dealing with Section 8, and so forth, multiple programs. Similar challenge of how do you get lots of grantors to kind of regard the party line and make the change that's been directed?
That's a very good question, Jeff. So actually, on a bi-weekly basis at NIH, Michelle actually serves as the chair of what we call the Grants Management Advisory Council. This is a meeting where all the chief grants management officers for each of the awarding ICs comes to meet. And when we issue a policy or get ready to implement a policy, we have extensive discussion at GMAC regarding the initial policy that we want to roll out and how that's going to affect the award-making process of each of the different ICs. So as you all know, each of the ICs has its own mission. So therefore, we have to make sure that the mission of the IC is also in line with overarching NIH mission as it relates to our implementation of a policy at the NIH corporate-wide level.
And just for clarity, IC is Institute and Center, which is kind of like one of the pieces that's making grants for a particular type of disease or health condition.
That is correct. And so what you may see oftentimes is if the NIH grants policy statement, like I said, serves as a standard term and condition for all awards. However, what you may see is some ICs, they may be IC specific terms that may come along with that appropriation for that particular IC. So at times if that's the case, then you will see those in the notice of award under specific terms and conditions for that particular award based on the IC specific requirement.
Just a question on that, in terms of the management of that. Does your office, as a higher level policy organization, do you support the implementation of those individual IC provisions and requirements, or do you pretty much leave that to them to manage and you just take care of the higher level policies that are applicable to everybody?
So it's almost twofold. So OPERA within OER, we manage the corporate-wide NIH policy. However, sometimes when there is an IC specific requirement that may have some sort of relation to the corporate-wide policy, we do have an interaction with the IC in order to ensure that the way that policy is being implemented is consistent. And when we receive questions, because we know we're going to receive questions, that we make sure that we're all on the same page as far as the implementation of that specific requirement. However, sometimes there may be a requirement that doesn't provide, that there isn't much flexibility in how it's implemented. And when those types of requirements, that's when the ICs pretty much stay implemented based off the statute, and we don't have much discretion into how we implement it.
So each IC will likely have some type of policy function and role that helps set the terms and conditions for their specific IC related programs?
Well, I would say for the most part, each IC, they have a grants administration shop, grants administration office. However, the policy shop is housed within the OPERA, and that's where my office is located.
Okay.
Please introduce yourself as you ask a question.
Jeff Thomas, Director.
Okay.
Contracts and Grants for NOAA.
Okay. Yeah, so I get just one example of a provision that's coming down the line for the appropriation this year. We received some money for opioids, and that money will accompany a requirement that for-profits actually provide a match for their funding. And so now we're currently working with the ICs who are receiving the opioid funding in order to ensure that those requirements are issued in a cohesive manner across the board.
Okay, thank you.
So like I said, Jeff, anyone, please feel free to ask any questions about any slides. This past fiscal year, and we all know that there were several hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. And in order to help assist with the recovery from those hurricanes, we actually, OMB issued guidance as far as being as flexible as possible. And so NIH, we issued a guide notice pretty much acknowledging that we would adhere to those additional flexibilities that OMB has provided. And we're actually currently in the process of developing funding opportunity announcements that will be published. So recipients who were affected by the hurricanes can come in and receive some disaster relief funding in order to recover from the storms over this past fiscal year. So now I'm going to touch on a couple of policy updates. As I mentioned before, these were issued throughout the fiscal year as it relates to various policies that were issued via a guide notice. The first is related to the 21st Century Cures Act. This was a major piece of legislation that provided a bunch of goodies for NIH, and more so in the realm of administrative burden relief. So what the 21st Century Cures Act did is it required NIH to no longer require investigators and institutions to actually apply for a certificate of confidentiality. Now the 21st Century Cures Act, in order to reduce burden, it mandated that NIH provide COCs automatically to those individuals or researchers who were conducting certain types of research. And the research that the COCs actually apply to are investigators engaged in biomedical, behavioral, or other research in which identifiable, sensitive information is being collected, or what we call covered information. And this is just a chart, which I call a cheat sheet, of what the requirements were previously prior to the 21st Century Cures Act implementation and what the requirements are now with the 21st Century Cures Act implementation. So essentially, just to give you some background on the COC, what COCs actually do is they protect the information regarding participants on research from being disclosed via a subpoena. But the 21st Century Cures Act actually also did was it prevented the involuntary or voluntary disclosure of the identification of those participants. So now voluntary disclosure is not prohibited under the law unless it's allowed by statute or with the consent of that particular participant.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
One of the things that we had a discussion, I think, 4 months ago in one of these sessions was how much information about an individual grant outcome should be shared with other grant recipients. And I had forgotten what it was related to. It might have been related to water quality or something like that. But essentially the question was, well, if you were making grants to 500 grantees and 20 of them are performing really, really well, can we share the names of those 20 or how they got to be so good with the others? And then kind of encourage people to kind of learn from that and improve. And I'm curious about, again, you have a whole bunch of different grantees. How, especially with the kind of the concerns about confidentiality, how does NIH share successes from one set of grantees with other prospective grantees?
Mm-hmm. So that's a very good point. Actually, I think the next slide may touch on that a little bit. No, this is good. It may touch on what we were thinking as it relates to being able to share those successes with other recipients and actually have our recipients share those successes with others as opposed to NIH forcefully having to do it. So I'm going to touch on this particular update and I'm going to see if this gets to the point in which you were bringing up, Jeff. So previously at NIH, we had a final progress report. And this final progress report was supposedly a report that was submitted in order for researchers to report out on the research that was conducted at the end of their project. However, NIH had a long-standing policy that if you come in, if a recipient came in for a Type 2 or computer renewal application, then the progress report that was submitted as part of that Type 2 was served in lieu of a final progress report. So as you know, NIH has large clinical trial networks, and most of these come in for Type 2, so these projects may go on for a 5-year block of time, then they get a Type 2, and they go on for another 10 years. However, we didn't have a way in order to report out on the successes of those particular recipients. Granted, we knew they had a project for a 10-year block of time after the successful submission of a Type 2. So when it came to implementation of the final RPPR, which was this new standard format for reporting out for the final year of progress for research awards, this was an initiative under the research business models in which NIH and NSF co-chair. When it came to NIH's implementation, we thought the best way in order to be able to make a shift within our current business process was to discontinue our Type 2 policy, which stated that, like I said, the Type 2 or the progress report contained in the application can serve in lieu of a final progress report. And the reason why is because with the implementation of the final RPPR, there was a project outcome section, which was a new section within the standard format that allowed recipients to report out in a concise manner the outcomes of the research that was funded over that previous competitive segment. So now with the implementation of the final RPPR, NIH actually has 3 types of RPPRs that we recognize. The first is the annual RPPR. This was a standard format that was previously approved by the RBM, Research Terms and Conditions, not Research Terms and Conditions, but RPPR Working Group. And this is the RPPR that's used on an annual basis. We now have an interim RPPR that is used whenever there is a Type 2 application submitted. And this interim RPPR is due 120 days after the period of performance end date. And now we also have a final RPPR that is required if a Type 2 application is not submitted. And as I mentioned before, The main difference between the annual and the interim RPPR and the final is that the interim and the final RPPR include the project outcome section. And as stated, with the implementation of the final RPPR, the project outcomes allows the recipient the opportunity to report out to the general public the outcomes of their research which was funded over that last block of time. We know that, is there a question?
Yeah, I mean, although this may be, if it's off point, please tell me, or if you're going to discuss it a little bit later. But I'm in the process of working with a colleague in the medical school in applying for a grant. And I know my colleagues in the public health school as well as the medical school talk about sort of hierarchies of grants, and I'm not going to get this quite right, but they talk about an R1 or you know what I'm talking about? If you're going to get to that, then hold off, but I'd just be curious to know kind of what that means and what the implications are when you're applying for funds.
So I'm not going to get quite to that particular point, because I think you're talking about more so an R01 versus one of your smaller R03s or your R21s exploratory research awards.
Right.
So the R01 is pretty much the bread and butter of NIH. It's one of our investigator-initiated awards, and which is the prize of NIH, so to speak, in the recipient community land. And a smaller award like a smaller R03 or one of your R21s are more so exploratory research awards.
Okay.
They're at a smaller dollar amount than an R01. However, they are a good mechanism in order for a recipient to come in and say, okay, I have a good idea. I'm not quite sure when I need this amount of money at the R01 level in order to accomplish it. But let me come in, explore the idea, and let's see if I can come in at a later date in order to obtain an R01 or submit a successful R01 application.
Thank you.
So that's more so the hierarchy that they may be referring to.
Great, thanks.
But all that, but all those are submitted in response to a FOA. They're not just, you don't just
No. So NIH has a policy in which all applications which we fund, they must be a response to a funding opportunity announcement. So for the R01, we have an R01 parent funding opportunity announcement, and also some ICs may have R01 applications as well. But then for the R03 or R21, those will also be issued via a funding opportunity announcement. Yes.
Does your agency fund any unsolicited research proposals?
So when we speak of unsolicited, we think of like our R01, those are investigator-initiated applications. So we have a parent R01 that says, okay, we will accept applications based off any ideas that the recipients have. So technically, when we say unsolicited, that's what we refer to as investigator-initiated unsolicited, but they all have to come into a funding opportunity announcement.
One of the things that I've noticed, your reporting requirements and the kind of change in policy about the end date report, that makes me think, well, that's important because that's telling you what eventually and finally NIH got for the taxpayers' money.
Correct.
And one of the things I've noticed is in conversations last week with some officials at the National Science Foundation is he said, you know, we are making a few changes in where we make a grant versus where we use a cooperative agreement as the vehicle. And clearly it seems to me that the cooperative agreement, which is kind of a little bit like a contract, but it doesn't have kind of a hard and fast deliverable, but it has kind of more stringent reporting and more things that look like deliverables, it strikes me that that's because they think, hey, we want more accountability. And as we look at the kind of the current environment politically, and to a certain extent even the president's management agenda, one of the major goals in the president's management agenda is results-oriented grants accountability. And so my question is NIH thinking about either cooperative agreements or other mechanisms that move more strongly towards accountability?
So for us, we have a long-standing, so let me answer that question in two parts. So all federal agencies we rely on their Federal Grants and Cooperative Agreements Act to determine which type of mechanism we're going to use. We have our U mechanisms, which are cooperative agreements in which substantial involvement is required. However, we have our basic R1s, which are grants. For us, it's not more so accountability per se, it's more so whether or not there needs to be substantial involvement on behalf of the NIH extramural staff in order to move forward their research. And that's largely aligned with the Grants and Cooperative Agreements Act, like I said. So what I've actually experienced is that sometimes an award may start off as a cooperative agreement with substantial involvement by NIH staff. Then, however, over time, as the staff reassess the program, they may say, okay, well, we have the proper oversight tools in place. We don't necessarily need to have so much involvement. We can transfer this over to a grant and still maintain successfulness of that research moving forward. So it all depends, it's like a case-by-case basis, where you may end up landing and what type of mechanism you may end up using at the final endpoint in order to get the outcomes that are expected.
So when you do that, do you draw up a new agreement if you started off in a cooperative agreement and then along the way you realize you don't need to be as involved? Do you now draw a new grant agreement with them?
So what we actually do at NIH, whenever there is a conversion from a cooperative agreement to a research grant or vice versa, what we actually do is we do revise the terms, but we make sure that NIH submits the formal notification to the recipient, acknowledging that we do want to convert this particular award. Once the recipient confirms that they are okay with the new terms and conditions, that's when we go through the process of converting the research award over and switching and convert the terms and conditions to a standard R1 term and condition. So there is a process, and we work hand in hand with our recipients prior to doing anything. It's not going to be a unilateral action on behalf of NIH. But very good question, though, Jeff. So another thing that has happened over the past fiscal year, I know there's been a lot of mention. I think, Jeff, you mentioned that someone came in regarding the GONE Act. That was the GREAT Act.
Great act.
GREAT Act, okay. So we've actually been working tirelessly over the past fiscal year in response to the GONE Act, which is the Grants Oversight and New Efficiency Act. And what this act does is it requires that NIH and other federal agencies close out open accounts and open grants that are open 1 year or more past the period of performance end date. So as NIH, as we received the GONE Act report that was funneled down by HHS, we actually had long-standing closeout requirements that have been a standard term and condition of our NIH awards for a very long time. So we issued a guide notice just to remind recipients of those closeout requirements and to inform recipients that NIH would move forward with the procedures in order to close out grants that have not met the timely submission of final closeout documents. So what we actually did was we reiterated that reports are late after 120 calendar days past the period of performance end date. And for NIH, since we're actually under the HHS umbrella, we have a process that requires us to take a unilateral closeout action if grants are not closed out no later than 270 days past the period of performance end date. And what this actually does, if NIH has not received the final FFR, the expenditure report, we are mandated to close that document out at the cash transaction level that's reported within payment management system. However, we do recognize that this could put grantees in a debt status. Therefore, unilateral closeout action is not something that we would like to do. However, we're mandated by HHS to complete this action if we are not able to successfully obtain final closeout documents.
Sam, may I ask, let's pretend there's some university that's receiving grants from NIH, and what do you know, perhaps they get grants from some other operating division of HHS, and let's pretend they even get grants from Jeff, from NOAA. And there's something that is systematic about that university overall that's led them to be lousy and to kind of, you decided, hey, we're going to do this unilateral closeout because they're just not well organized. Is there any way that pretend CDC or NOAA would learn about that?
So currently what we're doing.
Fabulous.
Yes, that's where I was going. So currently we are looking at that, and that, this non-submittal of final closeout documents, those are terms and conditions of the award. we have to take certain actions, and we can look across and see it's a systemic issue at that institution, then FAPIS is one of the vehicles that we can use in order to be able to insert that data into FAPIS. So other federal agencies, when they go in to make federal awards, since they're required to look in FAPIS as part of their peer award risk assessment, that is one way that we can get to addressing that systemic issue.
You said can, that makes it sound like sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't?
No. So actually, federal agencies are required to look in FAPIS as part of the pre-award
But I
risk
mean,
assessment.
so that's, they have to look before they make an award, but what about when they found some problem? Then they must report in, or they can report in, or is it just a question of timing?
So it's more so just a question of timing. So, like I said before, if a recipient materially fails to meet the terms and conditions of award, and that award has to be terminated, then federal agencies are directed to, in place, put that information into FAPIS. And so, as I mentioned before, the closeout requirements are a term and condition of award. And so, like I said, if there's a systemic issue, we start to see that across the board, then FAPIS is one of the vehicles that we can use to get to addressing that issue.
But that report to FAPIS is only at a failure to perform? Because there's no, yes, they're doing great, or they're just okay, it's only if they fail?
Fails to perform, yes.
Okay.
Yes. And like I said before, so just because an institution is in FAPIS, the requirement is that we review FAPIS prior to making that award as part of the pre-award risk assessment. However, if we look into FAPIS and we see something that is not directly tied to the research that we want to fund, we can still make a decision to make that award. However, like I said, the requirement is that we look to see what was reported in FAPIS, and based on our determination, we still want to make the award, we can do so.
Does any information ever get deleted from FAPIS?
I think there is a process for having information removed from FAPIS. I'm not quite sure of the parameters or the time frames right now on the top of my head. However, I can get that information for you. We have a division of grants, compliance, and oversight within the Opera office, who is responsible for entering data into FAPIS on behalf of NIH. So they could provide the appropriate information to respond to that question. The next policy that we discussed over the past fiscal year related to the documentation of personnel expenses. This particular guidelines that we issued really wasn't more so an update to NIH policy as opposed to more so a reminder. The uniform guidance actually updated the provisions for personnel documentation. It removed the examples that were previously provided within 821, which were examples, but they more so became the general practice across the board. And so recipients were using those as, okay, this is the standard which I have to follow. So the UG provided a lot more flexibility. And so NIH, what we wanted to do was actually recognize that we honored the flexibility within uniform guidance. I know we were still, with implementation of UG, receiving questions from institutions whether or not they could alter their internal systems to reflect the requirements that were identified within UG. So NIH wanted to more so, like I said, acknowledge that we accepted those and allow recipients to move forward with the updates that they needed to do in order to honor and recognize the UG flexibility. So the next policy relates to our inclusion policy changes. I do want to put a caveat there from the outset that these policy changes will go into effect January 25th, 2019. And what they actually do is they require, when research proposals are submitted, that there be some type of analysis whether or not, or determination on whether or not certain age groups need to be excluded from the research being proposed. So this analysis requires that all age groups be considered in research proposals that are submitted to NIH. However, if there is an exception needed or a certain age group is not necessarily applicable to that type of research, that there be an explanation as to why they should be excluded. This is especially important for our clinical research studies because within those studies, there is an expectation that individual data is submitted on sex, gender, race, ethnicity, and the age of enrollment with the annual progress report. So So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but this is just the implementation of the common rule. The common rule is directly mandated to increase the integrity of human subjects research and also reduce the administrative burden on human subjects types of research. The one thing I will say here is that the interim final rule has been delayed until July 19, 2018. However, there's an NPRM that's currently was published that is expected to push that date back. However, the pushback of that date has not been finalized at this particular time. A very important aspect of the NIH grant making process is the very beginning, and that's the peer review process. NIH issued a guide notice to pretty much reiterate and remind individuals of their roles and responsibilities in peer review and which actions they should not take within the peer review process. And just to very quickly give you a highlight, officials at applicant institutions are directed or should not contact reviewers on that study section that are responsible for evaluating the application. The only acceptable process for communication is through the SRO as it relates to the application that was submitted. This is very important because we often receive questions after review, regarding the conduct of reviewers. So therefore, we wanted to make sure that we submitted a guide notice that pretty much reminded everyone of the responsibilities of the peer review process. And this next slide just talks about the confidentiality and non-disclosure certification that reviewers are required to sign as their responsibility of participating on a review panel.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
One of the things we heard several sessions back from the National Science Foundation that I found interesting, of course they use peer reviewers in the similar way to NIH, but they also have a number of folks who are grants officers at NIH that are there on detail. So they work in the field at a university, the university loans that person to NIH, NIH pays their salary, and they aren't doing the peer review, but they're kind of helping manage the process, they're helping identify and attract applicants, and they're kind of helping, presumably, of course, identify the candidates for membership on the peer review panels. And I thought, that's interesting because they have people who really know the research side and the experience from the customer's perspective of a grantee coming in and acting for 2 years as the grantor. Does NIH do anything like that? And is there a reason why or why not if NIH does?
Well, we actually do have intergovernmental personnel agreements where people actually from the outside do come in and actually work for the NIH. However, if they do have any involvement in the review process, as stated before, they actually have to sign that confidentiality disclosure statement.
Yeah.
But quite naturally, that is advantageous for both the community as well as NIH, because some specific areas of science are so specific that they may be the only ones with the expertise that can advise on which types of reviewers should actually participate on that panel for that particular application set.
I'm curious, from some of you in the audience and other agencies, do you ever ask a grant recipient to come in and spend 2 years, promise that they won't actually participate in grant award decisions for their area of expertise, but to come in and spend a year or two kind of learning about the grantor side? HUD says no.
Not to my knowledge.
No. Noah? No?
When I was in Justice, they used to do fellowships.
Okay.
Come in, spend some time, learn the entire grant process from the federal side.
I'm trying to figure out, is that something that's kind
Yeah.
of unique to science and
I
research?
mean, there are other things that are maybe a little bit like this. So, for example, at HUD, you have the
Yeah, PMS.
OPDR, the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Policy Development, right? And they bring in people on these IPA agreements, for example, and they're going to be reviewing grants, but I mean they're not quite like the NSF people, but they are people that probably when they leave the agency, and it could be HHS, it could be HUD, it could be whatever, will be back applying for grants. I mean, that's a very normal kind of thing. So, I mean, that's...
The parallel I would think about though would be, you know, a state housing department director comes into Washington, works at HUD for 2 years, is precluded from any interactions with their state that they came from. But again, you know, what I really liked about that from the descriptions at NSF was, you know, it seems like a best practice because it gives a bunch of kind of real customer-based experiential knowledge about here's what people like, here's when and why they'll apply. If you want to attract more applicants or reduce burden, you know, they know well how to do it. It seems to me so far, and I'm just trying to check with you all, is this kind of unique to scientific research and to competitive grant making, or is it broader, and or perhaps should it be broader?
I mean, if you include social scientific research under scientific research, it's certainly not unique to physical sciences. I mean, it's, yeah.
Okay.
So at NIH, as you all well may know, we have a robust electronic research enterprise, which is our ERA system. So the next couple of slides, I'm just going to talk about some of the updates to our electronic submission process. So the first is it relates to our training awards. Moving forward, we are going to start the requirement for certain research data tables to be submitted within our extract system. However, we're not going to require it as of yet. We are looking to require these data tables to be submitted electronically via extract in late FY 2019. And at NIH, I always joke we have a plethora of activity codes, or what we call mechanisms. So oftentimes you may hear someone from NIH talk about R01, T32. And those are all activity codes related to a particular type of grant. But the NIH lingo is to only say the actual acronym as opposed to an R01 or a standard research grant. So of our training awards, these are the types of mechanisms that use the extract system to provide the research training data tables. These are our T32s, our TL1s, T15s, and T90s. But the primary thing I want to say here is that while we are going to mandate the data tables via extract be used, they are not mandated at this particular time. We will provide additional guidance when these will be required. However, we just want to provide advance notification that coming down the line, this will be something that recipients will be expected to do. As it relates to diversity supplements, NIH is constantly putting forth different policies and initiatives in order to increase the diversity of the biomedical research workforce. So what we actually are doing now is that we move towards requiring the electronic submission of all diversity supplements. Diversity supplements can be applied for when, let's say, a researcher has an R01, but they want to increase the diversity of the staff that are working on that research award. They can come in for a diversity supplement. Previously, these could be submitted via paper application. However, with paper application, is no way to have standardized data regarding diversity supplements that we were supporting. Therefore, we're moving toward an all-electronic process for diversity supplement applications. And this will help NIH better identify and track the progress of the diversity supplements that we are helping support on our research awards. So NIH, as I mentioned before, we serve on the RBM, which is the Research Business Models. And under the RBM, there were two major initiatives that NIH co-chaired. One was the final RPPR, and the other one was the Research Terms and Conditions, which was a set of Fed-wide terms that could be used for all federal research awarded agencies or those that participated in the Research Terms and Conditions. And as a part of the RTCs, there were certain prior approval requirements that federal research agencies were able to waive under what was previously known as expanded authorities. And see, these were long-standing terms of award that were previously provided within the NIH Grants Policy Statement as a standard term. But now what NIH has actually done is we've created an electronic prior approval system for those research awards that were excluded from the prior approval exclusions. So now what institutions can actually do for a no-cost extension, if a recipient was excluded from obtaining the first no-cost extension, they can now submit these requests electronically. Previously, we know they were submitted via email. Sometimes emails can get lost. So now we created this system in order to electronically track the submission of those requests. In addition to that, there are additional requests that can be submitted, such as the change in PI and PIs, as well as other senior key personnel identified on the notice of award. So what we often say at NIH is we talk about the timely submission of applications. What we often hear is it's 5 o'clock. Well, the applications due at 5 o'clock. However, we may get a call from someone at the institution at 4:55 asking about a certain piece of the application. So every chance we get, we always say register early and submit the application early. We do know, as it relates to registration, that SAM.gov is now requiring, does not have a new process for registered organizations in SAM.gov. They are now requiring a notarized letter be submitted, identifying that the entity the person that is initiating their registration is authorized at the organization to do so. We were previously made aware that this renewed process was only going to be for new registrants. However, I think as of the end of April, this process is going to be mandated for all registrants who are within SAM.gov. So I'd like to also say, as it relates to registration, if you cannot view your application in the ERA Commons, then NIH is not going to be able to review your application as well. So just some general policy reminders. This kind of touches based on what I mentioned earlier as far as closeout, but also on an annual basis, annual RPPRs are required to be submitted to NIH. And what this slide does is pretty much touch upon the time frames in which those reports are due to the NIH. And at the bottom of the slide is actually a searchable list where you can determine, or we advise our recipients to use in order to determine when progress report is due. Timely financial reports. Like I said, on an annual basis, we have final expenditure reports that are due, as well as the final RPPR that's due within 120 days following the project period end date. Another closeout document is the invention statements, the 568. This is actually a closeout document that many people may fail to acknowledge, but final invention reports are due as it relates to, in order to close out a document or close out a award on which inventions may be applicable to that research mechanism at the NIH. So NIH does a lot of educational outreach. We have the Office of Laboratory Animals and Welfare, in which they conduct many webinars and different training sessions. So what this slide does, it actually provides you with links to the webinars that are publicly available, and also they're tremendously helpful as it relates to disaster relief efforts. And they have a lot of resources available on their website, as well as FAQs. So NIH has a plethora of resources that we make available to our research recipients. We have our RPPR webpage that contains a lot of information. It also contains the RPPR application guide, which recipients can use in order to successfully submit or fill out their RPPR. Another valuable web resource is the OER webpage. Dr. Mike Lauer has an open mic blog in which he, whenever we roll out a new policy, Mike does accompany that with a blog in which pretty much puts it in layman terms, and you can have an open dialogue with Mike regarding the policy that was implemented at NIH.
I'm curious, Sam, whether or not there may be a subset of topics. I'm sure some of these are of interest to applicants, grant applicants, and some are of interest to individual institutes and centers within NIH. Some subset, I bet, though, might be interesting to other folks, whether it be at CDC or at NOAA or state or wherever. Is there any way that it would be easy enough for someone from one of these other departments to find which ones are interesting to them and would kind of say, hey, NIH found this fantastic new way of doing business, everybody else should consider doing this too?
Yes. So what we often do is we collaborate with our other definitely agencies within HHS that administer research awards. Mm-hmm. So for instance, AHRQ has a portfolio that is affected by what NIH does. So when we issue a guide notice, we will reach out to the other federal agency to determine whether or not they want to be included on the guide notice that we issue. And so sometimes they are, sometimes they want to issue their own guide notice to speak specifically to their recipients. But when we do that, we are collaborating, and as well as those questions that come into the open mic blog, if they're related to a guide notice that may affect another institution or another agency, we will speak to the NIH part, but then we will also allow the other federal agency to speak to any questions specific to their research portfolio.
Let me ask also, there are occasionally people who might be confused about, well, what is NIH doing compared to CDC, and how do I distinguish between them, for example? Tell us a little bit about how kind of planning happens to make sure there are not either duplication or conflicting requirements or such that, so it might look a little more reasonable to a university to understand, or let's say a third agency, let's say, for example, for which my wife works, who says, why is CDC doing that and not NIH, or vice versa?
Right. So that's always a good, an interesting question that we do receive. A good example of that is the research terms and conditions. So NIH is the co-chair of the RTCs, and we've been working to get other federal, well, not other federal, but other operatives underneath the HHS umbrella to participate in the RTCs. So this is an ongoing discussion. One of the key provisions within the RTCs that our research agencies have been able, well, our recipients have been able to take advantage of is the closeout requirements. So right now within uniform regulation, closeout documents must be submitted 90 days following the period of performance end date. However, NIH, as a member of the RTCs, we listen to our stakeholders via FDP, COGR, and other outlets, and they were saying, okay, well, we have this 90-day requirement. However, we have to, in order to meet this requirement, we have to roll up all the information that's being obtained from our subrecipients in order to meet that date. Can we extend that date to a more reasonable time frame? So hence you will see 120 days in the research terms and conditions. So NIH has implemented 120 days. However, you may see some other agencies that are still at the 90, even though they may support research. And as mentioned, we're having ongoing conversations to get them to hopefully come on board to the RTCs, but that's an ongoing discussion that we continue to work through, trying to get it consistent across the board. Yes?
Hi, John Drew at REI. I'm just fascinated by a number of the policy changes that you described. So things like the requirement of ages seems like something that's driven by policy or by PIV concerns, PII questions. Other things seem to be just efficiencies, so being able to submit type 2 instead of a final. How does NIH look at that? Is there a lens that says, how do I make the granting process more efficient? Is it sort of, here's the pain point that we're hearing from grantees that are having trouble submitting things? How do you get that information and decide what to do next?
It's a mixture of both. So for us, we know we have current long-standing policies that have been in place, and now we're getting the opportunity to look at what we currently do in order to see, okay, this is the most efficient way to conduct business. So that's with our long-standing policies that we may have in place. However, when we do obtain mandates that come down via legislation such as the 21st Century Cures that mandate efficiency, that's one way that forces us to look at it. But even prior to implement that policy, we look and see, okay, how can we implement this in a way that will be as least burdensome for our recipient community? Sometimes when we do that, it may be more work for the federal agency. However, we don't want to place that additional burden on the recipients in order to be able to implement whatever policy it may be.
I have
Yes.
a question about reporting to clinicaltrials.gov.
Mhm.
Are you going to get to that, or?
No, but you can, not today's presentation,
Okay.
but you can ask.
And it's the question of that in the report to the omnibus spending bill, there was a provision, there was language there that says, countering your recent definition of what a clinical trial is, and how is NIH interpreting that?
So currently, right now, NIH, we're working with congressionals in order to understand or make sure that we're able to properly respond to the language in the omnibus bill. Once we continue that dialogue. Once the resolution of that comes out, we're going to issue additional guidance via the normal channels, via guide notice, to pretty much be our response to whatever results from those dialogues with congressionals regarding the omnibus language.
Any idea when that's going to happen?
As of right now, no, but I know we are, like I said, we are working to make sure that we're able to adequately understand the requirement and be able to respond to meet congressional needs.
Thank you.
Sam,
Yes.
in January or so, George Washington and University and REI Systems conducted a survey of grant managers across the country. So these are both grantors at the federal level, grant recipients, state, local, and nonprofits as well. One of the prominent things they mentioned, 45% of them said, we don't like the amount of burden that seems to come from the federal government. And as a result, actually, the survey results, that one in particular, were named in the President's Management Agenda, where it said, we want to reduce the amount of time that is burdening grant recipients currently and that is spent on compliance. I didn't sense it was saying, we want less compliance. I just sensed it was saying, we want less burden. And so my question is kind of, you mentioned, here we want to do things in a way that are minimally burdensome or that reduce burden. Tell us a little bit about, what NIH kind of plans maybe to try and further reduce burden on grant recipients.
So I think I just gave you, one example, the certificates of confidentiality. So previously, like I stated before, recipients had to actually come in and apply for a COC to NIH. But now what we've actually done is part of our implementation, we no longer, for NIH awards, we no longer require recipients to actually submit an application for a certificate of confidentiality. What we actually did was, within the grants policy statement, we acknowledged certain criteria that will fit under a COC. So as a general term and condition of award, recipients, once they receive their award from NIH, they can look at the criteria and say, okay, does my research respond yes to these particular questions? If so, then I have a COC and I no longer have to apply. We view that as a major way to reduce the burden. There's no longer, I submit an application, then I have to wait. I may be receiving questions regarding the identity of individuals, but I'm still waiting from NIH. It's now, I got my award, my research is applicable to the policy, I have the COC in hand and I can move forward appropriately. So it's a lot of steps like that are being taken when it comes to implementation of policy, but it's a process that we take at NIH, like I said, to make sure that what we implement is as least burdensome on the recipients as possible. And so it's a work in progress, but I think we're making good progress in order to make it work. In addition to additional resources, we have frequently asked questions which cover a plethora of topics, such as PMS sub-accounts, core facilities, financial conflict of interest, and also the single IRB policy. We have various web pages which are available, which we have the OER web page, a page on our grants policy statement, as well as the NIH Extramural Nexus. These are some additional helpful web pages. Our OER listservs. I encourage everyone to actually sign up for OER listserv. The NIH, the guide notices that I speak to are published every Friday, and you'll get a long list of the funding opportunity announcements that have been published, as well as the guide notice articulating the policies that have been rolled out for that particular week. If there are any questions regarding anything regarding the funding opportunity announcement or particular submission of an application, then we have our grants information mailbox. Any general questions regarding like application instructions or just formats of web pages, contact our grants information office. If it's a grants.gov question, we funnel those to the grants.gov customer service inbox. And if it's a question regarding like an ERA system, please contact our ERA Commons Help Desk. For any policy-related questions, you can contact my office, Division of Grants Policy. Like I stated before, we work very closely with our Compliance and Oversight Office. They also have the grants compliance inbox. as well as our DEEDR office, which handles everything regarding inventions and buy dole. So that's the conclusion of the slide deck I wanted to run through. If there are any additional questions, feel free to ask at this time. Yes.
I have a question, not necessarily related to your presentation, but just from your bio and you speaking, you spent some time at HHS.
Yes.
And I know that HHS, or at least parts of HHS, use the grants management
Yes.
system. And I wonder if you have any experience with the REI system, and if you could provide a comparison of the two, of the strength and weaknesses
You mean
of
ERA?
each based on
ERA. So he uses, I believe NIH uses ERA.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
It does not use REIs.
Yes.
okay,
Yeah.
ERA.
Yes, we use the, NIH uses the ERA system. That's NIH, and we have other customers that we provide services to. And then also ACF, which is the Administration for Children and Families, they actually operate and manage the grant solution system.
I think the question was, as I understood from our earlier conversation, can you offer any kind of comparison between ERA and grant solutions?
Grant solutions.
Perceiving that maybe you have a little bit of experience with each, and I believe that HUD apparently is using grant solutions and is experiencing a few challenges.
Okay. So maybe that's a question I can handle, I can address offline.
Okay.
But for ERA, we're more so geared towards research, the research enterprise. That's what ERA was stood up for. However, I am learning and being made aware that other other agencies under the HHS umbrella, who may not be solely directed towards research, are becoming partners and customers under ERA, such as SAMHSA. I know ERA is developing some platforms for SAMHSA and other customers under the HHS umbrella, as well as other federal agencies. If there's a particular challenge that you may be concerned about, we can probably address that offline.
Okay, let's do that.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you.
And thank you. And as a small token of appreciation,
Thank you.
thank you.